Hi, and welcome to this video on using AdminUI to create clients in IdentityServer. My name is Kevin Jones. So in this video, we're going to use AdminUI from Rock Solid Knowledge to create clients inside IdentityServer. And we'll also create the related resources. So the things that these clients use that we want to protect. We'll create two clients, an interactive client and a machine-to-machine client. Now, to use these clients, we'll need some code. But this video is not going to show you how to write the full application code. What we will show is how to write the code you need to interact with IdentityServer. So setting up the services for authentication and authorization that will use these clients we register inside IdentityServer. And in fact, we'll write this code first. If you want to see how to write the full code that these applications use, then the other videos on this channel show you how to do this. Similarly, I'm not going to show you how to set up AdminUI. Again, there are other videos in the channel that show you how to do that. And we'll link to those videos below. Okay, so let's get to some code. So this is the first application, and I've opened this up inside JetBrains Rider. I've created this application from the REST template. So this is the default weather services application. I've made a couple of additions and changes to this. Firstly, if I look inside NuGet, we have these packages. So we have the JOT-Bearer package from Microsoft and the OpenID Connect package from Microsoft, and we'll need those. I've also changed one of the launch settings. So my application, when it launches, will listen on HTTPS localhost port 5445, and we'll need that information when we configure this inside IdentityServer. Okay, so to do that configuration, I need to add authentication into the services. Let's do that here. So we can say builder.services.addAuthentication. And we need to tell this the name of the authentication scheme. And there's a constant we can use to do that, and that's in JOT-Bearer defaults.authentication scheme. Once I have that, then I need to add my JWT bearer options for this authentication scheme. So inside our Lambda here, we tell our application how to connect to our authentication service. And that's going to be IdentityServer. So to do that, we set the authority. So that's the endpoint of the service we're going to use. And on this machine, I have IdentityServer running on ids.knowledgespike.local. And the port it's listing on is 5443. Now, obviously, this will be different for you. We can also here add an audience value. Now, this value is the name of the resource that we'll configure inside IdentityServer. And for this, I'm going to call it Weather API. And then finally, we need to tell it what type of token we're going to use. So we have this token validation parameters .valid types. And this is an array of string. And the value for our JOT token here is AT plus JWT. And then finally down here, I need to add a call to use authentication. And make sure the call to use authentication comes before the call to use authorization. So let me just show you one more thing. In my weather forecaster controller, I've marked the controller with the authorized attribute. So any access to this controller, we have to be authorized. So if I run the application now and try to hit this endpoint, we get back a 401 error. So given all that, let's go and configure this inside IdentityServer. And to use that, we're going to use AdminUI. So why use AdminUI? Well, you could update the IdentityServer database by hand, but there are going to be many tables to change. It's going to be easy to get this wrong, and it's going to be hard to find mistakes. Now, I guess you could write scripts to do this, but those scripts will need to be maintained and managed by you. AdminUI gives us a user interface to this database that's easy to use and easy to manage. And it also helps enforce industry best practice. So AdminUI is an application provided by Rock Solid Knowledge. And there are various ways that you can host this application. And there are various videos on this channel that show you how to do that. Once you have AdminUI installed and set up, then we can use this to manage IdentityServer. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to use this tooling to create 2 clients inside IdentityServer. And the first one of those is this REST service. So I'm going to log in. And then once I've logged in, we can go ahead and create the various bits that we need for our application. And for this one, I'm going to create 2 things. I'm going to add a protected resource. And then once we have that, I'm going to add a client that's going to use that resource. So here we do add resource. We need to give this an ID, and I'm just going to call this weather API. Now remember, in the code, we added an audience, and the name of that audience is the name of this resource. So these names have to match. We give this a display name, so weather API, and optionally we can give this a description, and this will appear on any consent screens. I'll leave that blank for now. Here we're not going to add any claims, so we'll just save this. So we now have this resource. But now what I can do is I can edit this, and I can add any scopes that I need into this resource. So let me add 2 scopes here. We'll add one for reading from the weather API. So we'll call this weather API.read. And this time the description is mandatory. I'll just make the description the same as the display name. Again, no claims for this. And I'll also add a scope called weather API.write. In case we ever need to write this API. We're not going to use this in this case, but just to show you that we can add more than one scope. And again, making the description and the display name the same. No claims. So we now have our protected resources. Once I have this, I can go to my clients and I can add a client. Now in this case, we want a machine client. So this is for machine to machine usage. There's no end user logging on to our REST service here. We're expecting the REST service to be called from another application. So I click on machine. The supported flow we're going to use for this is client credentials. We give this thing a name, and I'm going to use a name I used in a previous video where we set these applications up, and we'll use M2M client here, so machine to machine client. The display name, I'm going to use the weather API, and then we can specify the resources that this client uses. And for this, let's just choose reading from the weather API. Now we also need to create a shared secret here. And this will be used to prove that we are allowed access to this application. You can create your own shared secret, or we can ask the application to generate one for us, which I'll do here. And it generates this long random hex string for me. And I need to copy that because we'll need to use that in a moment. So I can add the shared secret. Notice that we can't see this again. So once it's in the database, you can't get back to it. It's stored securely. So when you create it, copy it yourself to use later on. Click on next, click on save, and then we're done. So then what I'm going to do, just as I've done in a previous video, is I'm going to use curl to get an access token. And then we'll use the access token to hit the weather forecast endpoint to allow us to authorize and to get back the data. So to get the access token, we run this curl command. So notice we're sending this command to https ids.knowledgespike.local on port 5443. That's IdentityServer. And we're sending it to the token endpoint. And notice as well the client secret. This is the secret we just associated with the client we just created using AdminUI. If I run this command, we get back this access token. And I'm going to copy this value. And then we can run this curl command. Notice here, I'm hitting my weather forecast endpoint. I'm setting an authorization header, and the bearer token is the access token we just retrieved from IdentityServer. So if I run this request, sure enough, we get back a 200 OK response with the data. So I've now registered a client using AdminUI with some protected resources. So now that we have that, let's go and create our MVC application that's going to hit this API. Okay, so we've registered the machine-to-machine client. Let's now go and create an interactive client. So if I go into clients again and add client, this time I'm going to create a web application. And notice here we can pick our flow. The default that's selected for us is authorization code flow plus Pixie. That's proof key for code exchange. We could choose a different flow here. This is the hybrid flow, but auth code and PXE are the recommended options. So click on start here. We need to give this an ID. And again, I'll use the same ID I've used in a previous video, and that's going to be interactive. The display name, again, could be anything we want it to be. So weather MVC application. And the others I can leave blank. So if I go next, we need to pass back here a callback URL. And this is the URL that's registered for the application. So my application will be running on port 5444 on localhost. And the callback URL is signin-oidc. And we can also specify the logout URL. And we'll set that to be signout-oidc. Once we have that, we can create a shared secret. And again, you'll need to copy this value and make sure we add it into the application. And then we can add some scopes here. Let's add in my user profile. Now, this client is going to turn around and call my REST API. So we need to specify the resources this application is allowed to access. And again, we'll want to read from the weather API. So we'll add that as a protected resource. And then we're done. And we can save the client. Okay, so let's go look at the application code that's going to use this client. That is this client, if you like. So first of all, this is my launch settings. And notice inside here, the client is listening on localhost port 5444. And we set that up as part of the URLs for IdentityServer. I've stored my configuration inside my app settings. So the authority URL is IdentityServer, listening on port 5443. The client ID is what we just set. That's interactive. The client secret is the one we just created. And the scopes I want to give this application access to are the weather API.read. Now I need to use these when I configure my application. So in program.cs, we configure OpenID Connect with the authority endpoint, with the client ID, with the client secret. Notice the response type is code. That's saying I want to use the authorization code flow. And we set use PKCE to true. So use PXE is set to true. One final thing to look at here is inside the controller for this application. My weather endpoint is marked with authorized. So a user has to authorize before they can hit this endpoint. So they have to log in. And then this controller turns around and calls my weather forecast endpoint on my REST API. And for that, we have to set a bearer token. Now, when I log in here, I'll get back 2 tokens. One of those tokens will be the access token, and that's the token I set when I call out to the REST service. And that token should have the correct scope set so I can hit the REST service. So I'm running both the Weather MVC and the Weather API applications. This is the welcome page for the MVC application. And from here, if I hit /home/weather, that's the protected endpoint on the controller. It asks me to authenticate. And if I authenticate correctly, this controller turns around and calls the Weather API, and we get back that data. So in this video, we've seen how to set up 2 clients, a machine-to-machine client, the REST service, and an interactive client, which is the MVC application. I hope you found this useful, and the code for these projects can be found here.